The rain was falling in slow, steady sheets as Karoline Leavitt stepped into the old brick municipal building in Oak Ridge, a small but tightly knit town in Virginia. She had been invited as a guest speaker to the monthly town hall meeting, not for politics, not for headlines, but to discuss a community issue that had stirred deep emotions: the possible closure of a long-standing public library. Inside, the meeting room was packed. Folding chairs filled every inch of space. Local citizens lined the back wall. Some wore raincoats, others held notepads. At the front sat a long table with 6 town board members, microphones crackling now and then. A banner behind them read, "Oak Ridge Town Hall, a place for every voice." Karoline took her seat in the second row, hands folded, posture calm. She had no official role here. She was just another citizen asked to offer perspective. But she knew her presence stirred feelings. Her name carried weight, both admiration and controversy. 10 minutes into the meeting, the board chair, a stern man in his 60s named Harold Whitman, cleared his throat. "We now invite Miss Karoline Leavitt to share her statement," he said, barely masking his disapproval. Karoline rose, walked to the microphone, and looked out at the audience. Her silver cross necklace glinted softly under the fluorescent lights. She could feel the room's tension, the sideways glances, the whispering in corners. "Good evening," she began. "I didn't come here tonight as a spokesperson or a politician. I came as someone who believes places like this library are more than buildings. They're the roots of our small towns. And when we pull up the roots, we risk losing the heart." Murmurs rippled through the room, some in agreement, some already dismissive. She continued, her voice even and thoughtful. But before she could finish her second paragraph, a man from the board interrupted sharply. "We appreciate your concern, Miss Leavitt," he said, "but we're not here for political speeches." A few audience members nodded. Others looked uncomfortable. Karoline blinked once, keeping her composure. "I'm not giving a political speech," she said quietly. "I'm giving a community one." The board chair tapped his pen against the table. "We'll give you 2 more minutes," he said. Karoline inhaled slowly. She knew what this was, an attempt to shut her down before she could even begin. But she wasn't going anywhere. Karoline didn't flinch. She stood tall behind the microphone, letting the tension hang for just a second longer. Then she continued, her tone steady, respectful, but with unmistakable strength behind it. "I understand some of you may not want to hear from me tonight," she said, her gaze sweeping across the board members and into the crowd. "But if we're serious about listening to all voices in this community, then you don't get to pick which ones are convenient." A quiet gasp came from the back of the room. The board chair shifted uncomfortably. Karoline wasn't angry. She wasn't raising her voice, but her words cut through the silence like a knife through still water. "I grew up in a small town just like Oak Ridge," she continued, "and I know what it's like to have your town's identity slowly chipped away. School programs removed, historical sites forgotten, and yes, libraries shut down to save a few dollars." She reached into her bag and pulled out a worn paperback. "This is the first book I ever borrowed from a library. I was 12. I didn't check it out because I had a report due. I checked it out because I wanted to understand the world." Some in the audience began nodding. A teenage girl near the front row leaned forward, listening intently. "I became who I am not because I always had the answers, but because I had access to places that taught me how to ask better questions." Someone in the audience clapped once, softly. Others looked around, unsure if they should follow. A man from the board leaned toward his mic. Miss Leavitt, if this is going to become an emotional appeal, I don't think this is the right setting. Karoline turned her head slightly. And if this board thinks it can make a decision that affects every family in Oak Ridge without emotion, then maybe you're in the wrong setting. That line hit hard. A few chuckles of support emerged. Someone whispered, "She's right." But the board chair scowled. "One more outburst, and we'll ask you to yield your time." Karoline looked straight at him. "You can cut my time," she said, "but you can't cut the truth." And with that, the entire room went still. Karoline's words lingered in the air like a tremor. For a moment, no one moved. Even the board members, those who had been ready to dismiss her, sat frozen, unsure whether to push back or let her continue. She glanced at the crowd again. This time, she saw their eyes, not just watching, but waiting. Some curious, some cautious, all quiet. So she kept going. "I'm not here to shame anyone. I know budgets are tight. I know decisions are hard. But we have to ask, what do we lose when we treat libraries as optional?" She walked a few steps away from the podium, speaking with her hands, her voice slightly softer now, almost like she was having a conversation instead of giving a speech. "We don't just lose books. We lose safe spaces for kids who have nowhere else to go after school. We lose warmth for the elderly who sit by the window and read the paper every morning. We lose community." A woman near the back, probably in her 60s, whispered, "That's true," to the man beside her. Karoline turned back toward the board. "You say I'm being emotional. I say, thank you, because emotion is what moves people. It's what makes a community worth fighting for." Another soft clap. Then two. A few more. Still, the chair raised his hand, trying to bring the room back under control. "We need to return to procedure," he said firmly. But this time, someone from the audience spoke up. A tall man in a trucker's cap, standing near the middle. "Let her finish." Heads turned. "She's saying what half of us came here to say, but didn't know how," he added. The tension shifted, no longer aimed at Karoline, but at the board itself. The chair looked flustered. He tapped his pen again, then leaned toward the mic. "You have 1 minute," he said. Karoline nodded once and stepped back to the podium. "In that 1 minute," she said, "I'll just ask this. If this library was gone tomorrow, would your lives be any different? And if not, ask yourself why it matters less to you, when it means everything to someone else." Silence. Not forced, not tense, just still. Because sometimes the truth doesn't need a full speech. Just a voice willing to say it out loud. As Karoline stepped away from the podium, the room stayed quiet. Not because they were done listening, but because they didn't want the moment to end too soon. She returned to her seat in the second row, calm and composed, as if nothing unusual had happened. But something had. The energy had shifted. The board shuffled papers, trying to resume the meeting as planned. But the crowd had other ideas. The man in the trucker's cap raised his hand. "I'd like to speak next," he said. The board chair hesitated, clearly wanting to move on to the next agenda item. "Sir, we're short on time." "Then I'll be quick," he replied. He walked to the front. "I don't always agree with that woman," he said, pointing gently toward Karoline. "But she reminded me of something tonight. We can't let what's practical bury what's important." He looked toward the board. "You want to shut the library down to save money? Fine. Then tell the kid who reads there every day that his stories don't matter. Tell the single mom who uses the internet there to apply for jobs that she's on her own now. Go ahead." He paused. Or you could just listen. He stepped down to quiet applause. Then another person stood, a young woman in a hoodie. Then another, an elderly man with a cane. They weren't shouting. They weren't angry. They were just speaking. One by one, voices filled the room, brief, honest, and heartfelt. I got my GED studying in that library. My daughter learned to read there. It's the only place I can sit and not feel alone. The board members sat still, stunned. What was supposed to be a routine meeting had become something else, something raw and real. And Karoline? She didn't say another word. She didn't need to. Her words had already unlocked the room. The board hadn't planned for this. Their agenda was printed, color-coded, and timed to the minute. They expected minor objections and quick approvals. But what they got instead was a full-room awakening. People who'd come just to watch, now raising their hands to speak. And the reason was clear. Karoline's calm challenge had cracked something open. Not with outrage, not with volume, but with sincerity. The board chair looked uneasy as another resident stood, this time a high school student, no older than 16. He approached the microphone, voice trembling but determined. I know I'm not supposed to talk at these things, he said, but I use the library after school. My mom works late, and we can't afford internet at home. That place isn't just for books. It's for people like me who want to stay out of trouble and get somewhere. He looked straight at the board members. If you close it, I don't know where I'll go. A hush followed. Some in the audience wiped their eyes. One of the board members, a younger woman, looked visibly moved. I didn't know, she whispered, leaning to a colleague. More voices followed. Each added weight to the room. Each one more personal, more powerful. By now, the original plan to move to the next vote had been all but forgotten. Finally, the board chair raised his hand to speak. We were prepared to make a decision tonight, he said slowly. But clearly, we need more time to listen. A few gasps, hopeful ones, rose from the crowd. He cleared his throat. We're tabling the vote. We'll reopen community discussion on the issue for 2 more weeks before any final decision is made. A wave of relief swept through the room. No loud cheering, no dramatic outburst, just honest applause. Karoline didn't clap right away. She simply looked down at the notebook in her lap, the same one she'd used at the White House to prepare for briefings. Tonight, it had held only 5 sentences. And somehow, they'd been enough. Because this wasn't about her. It never had been. It was about showing people that if you speak with purpose, others find the courage to speak too. The meeting ended later than scheduled, but no one seemed to mind. Neighbors who had barely spoken before were now shaking hands. Some exchanged numbers. A few stood around Karoline, thanking her, not just for what she said, but for how she said it. You didn't yell, you didn't lecture, one woman told her. You just reminded us why this matters. Karoline smiled. I just said what many of you were already thinking. Outside, the rain had stopped. The air smelled of wet leaves and wood, and the old brick steps of the town hall were slick underfoot. A local reporter, young, probably fresh out of college, approached her on the sidewalk. Miss Leavitt, I didn't expect tonight's meeting to go like that. I've covered 3 years of town halls, and I've never seen a room turn like that. Karoline chuckled softly. Sometimes all it takes is one honest question. The reporter hesitated. Can I ask, how did you stay so calm when they tried to shut you down? Karoline looked past him, toward the trees swaying in the soft breeze. Because I wasn't there to win. I was there to be heard, she said. And when you know why you're speaking, Their silence can't stop you." He nodded, scribbling her words quickly. Back at the meeting hall, the young student who'd spoken earlier stood beside his mother. She placed a proud hand on his shoulder. "I've never seen you speak like that," she whispered. He shrugged. "I didn't plan to. But when she stood up, I felt like I could too." That ripple, small but real, was exactly what Karoline had hoped for. Not headlines, not praise, just motion, just truth passed from one voice to another. As she walked to her car, she paused, pulling out her phone. A message from a former colleague blinked on the screen. "Saw the town hall video. Whatever they tried to do, you handled it like a pro. You reminded people what leadership actually looks like." Karoline smiled faintly. Not all leadership needs a podium. Sometimes it starts with being willing to stay standing when others try to cut your time short. Karoline hadn't realized anyone had recorded the meeting. But by the next morning, a 3-minute clip was already spreading on social media. It captured the moment the board tried to cut her off, and the moment she refused to let her voice be buried. Her quiet strength, her question about the library's worth, and the ripple of support that followed were all there, raw, unedited. A local high school student had posted it first, writing, "She spoke for all of us when we didn't know how." By noon, it had 20,000 shares. By evening, national accounts had picked it up. No shouting, no anger, just leadership. They tried to silence her. She made them listen instead. This is how you stand for something with grace. Karoline's name trended for the first time in months, not for controversy, but for clarity. She received hundreds of messages, parents, teachers, librarians, teenagers. Even critics admitted they respected how she handled the moment. But one message stood out. It was from a retired public school teacher in Minnesota. "In all my years of teaching, I always told my students that calm courage is louder than noise. You proved that true." Karoline saved that one. Back in Oak Ridge, the town board met privately to discuss the overwhelming response. They hadn't expected pushback. They certainly hadn't expected a national conversation. The board chair, Harold Whitman, looked down at the printout of emails they'd received. "You think she planned that?" one member asked. Harold shook his head. "I think she just meant every word." The younger board member who'd looked, moved during the meeting, said quietly, "We should have listened sooner." Meanwhile, a group of local teens had organized a community book drive, calling it the Shelf Project, to show how much the library mattered to them. Their slogan? A quote from Karoline. "If it means everything to someone, it should matter to everyone." She hadn't just inspired applause. She'd inspired action. 2 weeks later, Karoline returned to Oak Ridge, quietly, without cameras or fanfare. She sat in the back row of the town hall, this time as a guest, not a speaker. The board was about to cast its final vote on the library's future. The room was even more crowded than before. Students who had never attended a meeting now sat alongside retired teachers, young parents, and longtime residents. In the corner stood a donation bin overflowing with books, evidence of the town's growing pride in its own story. When the agenda reached the library vote, the chair cleared his throat. "Before we begin," he said, "we want to acknowledge the outpouring of letters, emails, and community efforts over the past 2 weeks." He looked toward the crowd, then toward Karoline, who sat with a neutral expression, hands clasped in her lap. "And we want to say, we heard you." He nodded to the board. "All in favor of preserving full library operations, say aye." A chorus of voices responded, steady and unanimous. "Aye." Applause erupted. Not wild, but deeply meaningful. Karoline didn't stand, didn't wave, didn't move to the front. She simply smiled. A teenage girl seated nearby leaned over and whispered, "That was because of you." Karoline shook her head gently. "That was because of all of you." As the meeting adjourned, the board chair made his way toward her. The same man who once tried to cut her time short now extended a hand. "You changed this place," he said. "I didn't think one voice could do that." Karoline returned the handshake. "One voice can't, but one voice can remind the others they have one too." That night, as she drove away from Oak Ridge, her phone buzzed again. A student had tagged her in a post. It was a photo of the new bulletin board at the library entrance. At the top was a simple quote, "You can cut the mic, but you can't cut the truth." And beneath it, "Thanks for reminding us." Karoline closed her phone and looked out at the road ahead. No title, no podium, no stage, just purpose. And sometimes, that's all you need to be heard. They tried to cut her short. They tried to dismiss her words. But Karoline Leavitt didn't raise her voice. She raised the room. In a moment where silence was expected, she spoke. Not for attention, not for power, but for the people who needed someone to say what they couldn't. And in doing so, she reminded everyone that courage isn't always loud. Sometimes it simply refuses to sit down. From one voice came many. From one question, a town found its answer. This isn't just a story about saving a library. It's about the power of speaking when it matters most. Thanks for watching this episode of Surprising Stories. If this moment inspired you, share it with someone who needs to be reminded. Your voice matters. And it just might be the one that changes everything. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more stories that surprise, inspire, and uplift. Because the world needs more voices, exactly like yours.